All right, so this video is going to talk about the effects of a price floor. I've already done a video on the effects of a price ceiling, and the most common effect of a example of a price floor is probably the minimum wage, and so that's what this video will focus on, that example of it. But what we can see is that a price floor is a legal minimum price. Again, it would be a response by if we wanted to go to our Congress or politicians and say, oh, we think that the price of this good is too low. Well, why don't we pass a law raising it? Can we just pass a law to raise the price of a good? Now, of course, if we're mostly acting as consumers, we really actually prefer to have the things that we buy be cheaper. So consumers often have a demand for price ceilings, so that might lower the price of goods. When you're a seller, you want a higher price. So in the market for labor, in the market for labor, we have the quantity of labor here. But remember, we have demand and supply. And in the market for labor, the supply would be workers. The workers are offering their time and skills available in the marketplace. So the suppliers of labor are you and me, people. And the demanders are firms. So we like high prices for the things we sell. So if we say, like, hey, some people that make a low wage in the labor market, why don't we pass a law saying they have to get paid more? And so that's effectively what a minimum wage is going to try to do. I have it drawn in here with a supply curve and a demand curve. And again, all we're doing is affecting the price. So there's going to be no shifts in demand or supply. In this case, we just keep the demand curve and the supply curve as it was. We have the equilibrium depicted in here, just where supply intersects demand, or the price, or in this case, the wage is the price for labor. Where the wage, where the quantity demanded of labor equals the quantity supplied, meaning that everybody who wants to work can find a job. Everybody in firms can hire as many people as they want to hire at that given wage. Now, one thing to note before we go any further here, just so there's no confusion, although we might be talking about the labor market, there's actually many different types of labor out there. There are many labor markets. And only a relatively small percentage of American workers work at the minimum wage. So what we would probably say is that most workers are in other labor markets for more skilled labor. This would only generally be labor markets with pretty low skilled labor would be the ones where the minimum wage might be relevant. So you're looking at the market for accountants or professional football players. They make or economics professors. We all make way above the minimum wage. So and before the recent increases in the minimum wage, only about 2 to 3% of American workers made the minimum wage. So this is what we would talk about for that segment of the labor market. This isn't for everybody out there at the labor market. Most people would have an equilibrium wage that would be well above the minimum wage. And in the case of a non-binding price for what that they talk about in the book would actually apply for many workers. Okay. So we have the equilibrium depicted here. And then to have a price floor that's going to be meaningful, we want to set a legal minimum price above the equilibrium wage. So let's say if the equilibrium wage was $6 an hour, we might set a minimum wage at $8 an hour. And then the diagram would look like this. If you want to talk about the effects of raising the minimum wage, like Florida just voted to raise its statewide minimum wage from like $8 and I think 70 cents an hour to $15, then that would be really somewhat sort of similar to what we have. It'd be like raising the minimum wage up even further, going to a higher price floor. So, but if you want to understand the basic effects of a minimum wage, even like increasing the minimum wage, this diagram will give you a pretty good place to start. So we have a legal minimum wage here. And so at this legal minimum wage, again, in markets, we have to have exchanges be voluntary. So we'll look over to the demand curve and the supply curve to get the quantity, demand, and supply. So at a wage above the equilibrium, we hit the demand curve first. So then when we hit the demand curve, we come down. That gives us the quantity demanded of workers, the number of workers firms would want to hire. And we go over to the supply curve and hit the supply curve and come down. That gives us the quantity of work, number of people who would want to work. We see that the quantity demanded, or the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. So we have a surplus in this market. When we were talking about equilibrium in chapter 3, we said if the market happens to be at a price above the equilibrium, well, it won't stay there because there'll be downward pressure on the price. And in the labor market, if the price of labor is above the equilibrium, well, you'd have like workers who are unable to get hired, and that somebody who's not going to get a job would be willing to perhaps underbid those who are able to get the job. There'd be downward pressure on the price, and we'd expect to see the price fall.
Sorry, Dad.
So we have a legal minimum price here, and but with that legal minimum price in place, we'll be assuming that firms are unwilling to cut the wage or unwilling to lower the wage because they'd be violating the law. So we're assuming there's some enforcement of the law, and so the wage won't get lowered. So we have a surplus in the market, and it's going to persist. In a few chapters, we'll be talking about how we measure unemployment, and when there's people looking for work and they can't find work, that would turn out to be unemployment. So a surplus in the labor market is going to tend to be unemployment or higher unemployment. So we would expect to see segments of the labor market where the minimum wage is applying to see higher unemployment. And one of the areas where we see this is teenagers, and teenagers always have a much higher unemployment rate than the overall unemployment rate for the economy. And that's often because teenagers are just entering the job for the labor force for the first time. They maybe haven't graduated from college yet. They don't have all of the skills they have. They're working at low-skilled jobs. They're affected by the minimum wage, and we see higher unemployment rates amongst groups of workers who are likely subject to the minimum wage. But we also can compare the quantity demand of workers, because in the market, every exchange has to be voluntary. You have to have a willing buyer and a willing seller. The fact that you've got a lot of people willing to work here is irrelevant, because you're only as many people as firms want to hire are going to be able to find jobs. And so QD will be the number of people employed with the minimum wage in place, and we can see that QD is less than the equilibrium quantity. There will be fewer jobs available. And economists often talk about this as a minimum wage destroys jobs and reduces employment. And this is the part that we're really referring to here, the fact that there'll be fewer people employed than there would be in equilibrium if there wasn't a minimum wage in this market. And we're going to get that as a result as long as this demand curve slopes downward. So as long as the demand for labor by firms is a downward sloping, which the law of demand suggests is always going to be the case, there'll be some reduction in the number of workers. Now, it would become much of it might have, if you follow economic policy, there's been some discussion about some of the recent studies on the minimum wage, or new thinking about the minimum wage. And what that really sort of suggests is that there are some studies, not all studies, but a couple of studies suggest that the number of jobs lost here could be pretty small. And so it would be an empirical question exactly how many jobs would be lost. Is it a small number or is it a relatively large number? Because what we can see is anybody who stays employed with a minimum wage does make a higher wage than they would in the equilibrium. So workers who remain employed do get get paid more. So if you think about, you look at like the federal minimum wage is currently $7.25 an hour, and if you're looking at thinking like, man, it would be really hard to live or raise a family on $7.25 an hour, let's raise people's wages. Well, the minimum wage would do that, or raising the minimum wage would do that, but only for the people who manage to keep their jobs, only for the people up to QD here. Some people are going to lose their jobs. And so if you want to say, does the minimum wage accomplish what it's intended effect? It does to some extent, there are job losses for the people who lose their jobs. They might be saying like this isn't such a good deal. For the people who keep the jobs and are able to get employed, they are clearly making more money. So they might say like, oh, this is a pretty good deal. But there are going to be fewer jobs available. It's just a question of how many fewer jobs are going to be available. But then, so those are the sort of the initial effects that we can see directly off the graph. But there are some additional effects that kick in here. One of the things is that there could be reduced training or less flexibility. Businesses, if you talk to anybody who's run a business, they'll always be talking about like the full cost of employees, and that full cost of employees would add on there any benefits, any taxes, and so forth. But it also, in some cases, would include any training. If you're providing training to workers, that's costly to provide workers training. If you let workers, especially like say college workers, college students who are holding a job, have a lot of flexibility in their schedule. So they don't have to work during final exams weeks, or you understand that they might be out of town during breaks, and so they won't be working over Christmas. So if you give workers more flexibility in their hours worked, that's more costly because that means they may be working fewer hours, and you have to give them time off, certain days off, and you have to have other workers who can work. So one effect of a minimum wage over time could be reduced training, less flexibility in the hours, maybe reduced benefits as well. That you get a higher wage, but they cut back some benefits that you have. And so these would be other dimensions of employment, and there could be some retrenchment or less favorable terms on these other dimensions of employment. So you get a higher wage, but you get less training. And maybe that means that you need to work at the minimum wage job, but you don't get training that would allow you to eventually get a much higher paying job. There would also be the fact that there's a surplus in this market suggests that there would be a possibility for undocumented work. There are people who would like to work at the minimum wage and are not getting any jobs, so they're not getting any take-home pay. They might be willing to work for less than the minimum wage. And so to the extent that employers would be willing to break the law at all, they'd be able to have some people work off the books or something like that, then there could be a market for undocumented work. But we can certainly say that there would be the demand for that. The workers who are unable to find any employment here would be willing to work for a lower wage. And so if the employers can find some way to skirt the law or are willing to try and skirt the law, there could be a market for undocumented work. And then one other thing we've seen economists looking at a minimum wage in the past, especially the very early minimum wages adopted in the 1920s and 30s, is that they often involved racial discrimination. The reason why that might happen is that there's a surplus. You have more workers, more people applying for a job than you have jobs to fill. And that means from the employer standpoint, you can pick and choose. And if employers would prefer not to hire certain workers, then they could, then they could pick and choose amongst the workers and pick the workers that they would like to have to fill the jobs that they have available. If, on the other hand, if you're at the equilibrium, the quantity demand equals the quantity supply. The firms are going to have to hire all the workers who are available, because if they pick and choose and they say like, oh, we don't like these workers over here, so we're not going to hire them, then they'll probably end up having jobs that would go unfilled simply because there are not enough extra workers. There aren't extra workers available at the equilibrium. So there's also the possibility of discrimination. As the book talks about the long-run effects, and again, the long-run effects, as I mentioned for a price ceiling, the long-run effects tend to be greater than the short-run effects. In other words, in the long run, the number of jobs that might be lost will be larger than it would be in the short run. Because in the short run, firms are pretty much fixed in terms of the capital they use. In the longer period of time, then like restaurants, for instance, could be switching over to make, especially now, if people are going to order off an app, you don't have to have somebody there at McDonald's to take the order. So you could switch some, you could automate some jobs, and you have a greater ability to automate jobs in the long run than you could in the short run. And it's going to take time to develop the automation to replace some minimum wage jobs. That's what we're going to see And, again, that's likely to happen over a longer period of time. That comes back to this whole question of how much is the number of jobs going to be reduced. Some of the studies that have claimed to document relatively small effects of the minimum wage have often looked at a very short time period after the implementation of the a minimum wage hike. And as more time goes by, the demand for labor becomes flatter or more elastic, and the number of jobs that would end up being lost would be larger because firms would be able to automate some of these jobs when they're given more time to do so, knowing that they'd have to otherwise pay the workers a very high wage. So these are the effects of a minimum wage or any price floor. And so we've had a video now of both price ceilings and then one on price floors.